Madam President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, I ask the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. I rise simply to ask unanimous consent that my intern, who is shadowing me today, Chloe Becker, be accorded full privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I ask the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Merkley of Oregon on the floor a few minutes ago. He's the prime sponsor of the ENDA bill, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, a bill that would ban employers from using sexual identity or gender orientation in hiring, in promotion, or firing decisions. Several amendments are expected, including one by Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, which would maintain protections for religious employers. And a vote is likely later in the day on moving forward with the legislation, the ENDA bill. There are hearings underway on Capitol Hill today, Senate hearings. The House is out this week and back next week, next Tuesday. The Senate Finance Committee met this morning, hearing from Kathleen Sebelius on the rollout of the healthcare.gov website. We'll show you all of that hearing beginning at 8 o'clock tonight over on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
President, the budget conferees are working to reach agreement on the fiscal year 2014 budget. I want to compliment Senator Murray for the great work she has done on this. And I would join those who have expressed strong support for their efforts. We all know what the consequence is going to be if we don't reach agreement on the budget. We have draconian cuts to defense acquisitions and readiness, but also the social safety net programs, to infrastructure, to public schools, to police, to every federal program. Every federal program is going to suffer, and every American will feel the impact in my state and in the other 49 states. Now, having been in the Senate a long time, I know that anything that gets done around here happens as a result of compromise. Nobody gets everything that he or she wants. And when it comes to a budget agreement, that means that you have to have additional savings, but you also need increased revenues. There's no other way. You have to do both. I think back to the time when we not only had balanced budgets but had a surplus in the last Democratic administration, but we also did not have the kind of specialized tax cuts to those in the highest bracket. Ironically, those in the highest bracket made more money during that time because the whole economy was better. And those who think it can be done by only cutting spending or by closing corporate loopholes, but not by doing both in their legislators in name only. That's simply a recipe for a continued gridlock, another year of sequestration, which would be a disaster. It would allow everybody to go off and give rhetoric, but not face reality. They could talk about what they want, but never have to vote anything. The fact is, if you want to do this, you have to cast some tough votes. The outcome of this budget conference will determine the extent to which the Congress will play a meaningful role in federal spending for the rest of this administration and possibly well beyond. I would advise my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I've been here with both Republican and Democratic administrations. If the Congress is going to actually have a voice as an independent third branch of government in how the government is run and what we do, then we have to start facing up and doing real budgets and real appropriations bills. Otherwise, just assume there's a top dollar level in there and the administration will do whatever it wants to do, Democratic or Republican. That's not what I feel I was elected to, here. I feel as one of 100 senators I should have a voice in what comes out of it. The outcome of this budget conference can determine the extent to which the Congress will play a meaningful role in federal spending, not only for the rest of this administration, but possibly well beyond. As I said, let me give a couple of concrete examples. I want to do that by comparing the impact of the fiscal year 2014 House and Senate versions of the bill that funds the Department of State and Foreign Operations. And the choices are stark and puts things in perspective. The House bill provides $40 billion to fund the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and our contributions of World Bank, UN peacekeeping, countless other organizations, and programs that contribute to global security. In contrast, the Senate bill would provide $50 billion, 25% more than the House bill, for the same agencies and programs. But before you think that means the Senate's the big spenders, well, actually the Senate bill respects the current budget climate. It is $500 million below the fiscal year 2013, continuing resolution after sequestration and across the board reductions, has many budget reductions and savings. But unlike the House bill, we are selective of how we do it. We don't make draconian and reckless cuts that would weaken U.S. influence and cede U.S. leadership to our competitors. And given the situations in Syria, North Africa, other areas of conflict, areas of conflict that could involve and engulf the United States at a moment's notice, as well as the unpredictability of natural disasters. Funding for international crises response and humanitarian relief is a matter of life and death for millions of the world's most vulnerable people who look to the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth. The current demand for these programs, and certainly my mail shows strongly supported by the American people, is unprecedented and growing. But the House bill cuts these programs $1.6 billion below the Senate bill. And one of the most troubling cuts in the House bill is for international organization, in which the United States plays a major role in addressing global threats to us and our allies like transnational crime, disease epidemics, and climate change that no country can solve alone. Mr. President, some of the most virulent, most deadly diseases in the world today are not on our shores, but can be on our shores in a matter of hours from other parts of the world. Aside from the total humanitarian reason, we have a good reason to do something to help combat those diseases. But instead, the House would end our support entirely for many of these organizations. They would create large arrears of money that we're obligated by treaty to pay. They're saying, okay, we agreed to pay this, but sorry, we're the United States. We don't have to keep our word. I don't think most Americans want to hear that. But they would also erode our influence with other major contributors and shareholders like the Europeans, China, India, and Brazil. Ask any one of our international corporations. Ask any one of our organizations in this country, medical facilities, anything else that have to work around the world. Do they really want the United States to give up its influence? The House bill provides no funding, not one single dollar, for U.S. voluntary contributions to the United Nations Children's Fund, or the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the Montreal Protocol, which protects the ozone layer. Well, the Senate bill does include money for those, at about the same level as 5 years ago. I'd like more, but I don't want to go to the House, which has nothing. And so while the House would end our participation in UNICEF and many other U.S. agencies, the Senate bill freezes spending for these organizations at the 2009 level. The House bill, for example, provides $746 million, 50% less than the Senate bill, for assessed contributions. These are contributions that we're required to pay to international organizations like NATO, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organizations, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and many others. What we're saying, if some disease breaks out in the world and may come across our borders, well, gosh, that'd be terrible, but we can't give any money to the World Health Organization to try to stop it. What, there's a question of nuclear proliferation? Sorry. We can't give the money we are required to give to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, we're already in the Senate bill $72 million below the fiscal year 2009 level, but the House bill is more than $750 million below. Now, does anybody believe the needs of NATO or the International Atomic Energy Agency or the World Health Organization are less today than they were 5 years ago? All you have to do is watch the news. All you have to do is read some of the reports, some of the intelligence briefs that every senator can read. You're not going to come up and say, well, the threat's less today than it was 5 years ago. You're going to say, as I do as I read these reports, the threat's a great deal worse than it was 5 years ago. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous not to be involved in these organizations. In fact, the House bill provides not one single dollar for most international financial institutions like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So they can say to us, okay, debtor nation, okay, United States, you agree to these, but you're not paying your bill. We can't trust the United States, so we're not going to let you have any say in these. We're not going to let you have the leadership you've always had in these institutions. In fact, the House bill provides not even a dollar for the key multilateral environmental funds, which support clean energy technology, protect forests and water resources, including the Global Environment Facility, the Clean Technology Fund, the Strategic Climate Fund. It's bad enough here in the Senate. We freeze these last year, but at least we have some money in there. The House has nothing. In fact, they don't provide a single dollar for the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. The Senate bill at least has the same level as last year to help the poorest countries prevent chronic malnutrition and famine. You know, Mr. President, we all say, why can't we have countries develop so they're not open to some of these terrorist organizations, fundamentalist organizations that step in? Well, we have a stake in helping them. It doesn't require much money, tiny fraction of 1% of our budget, but to just walk away from it, it makes no sense from our strategic interests, but also, what does it say about our moral interests as the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth? We have to speak to what is the moral value of the United States. And frankly, what they've done in the other body does not speak well to our moral core. Not the moral core of Americans that I know in my state, both Republicans and Democrats alike. We all understand the need for federal departments and agencies to reduce costs and eliminate waste, find efficiencies. We do this. The Senate bill is $500 million below the fiscal 2013 continuing resolution. But what we try to do is say at least the United States has to keep its word. At least the United States ought to show involvement in parts of the world where it counts. Unfortunately, in the other body, their bill may make great sound bites, nice bumper sticker politics, but it endangers the United States, it endangers our security, and it gives the image of the United States as a country that cannot keep its word. We can't do that. Let's get forward, let's get our budget resolution, let's pass our appropriations bills, because right now everybody gets to vote maybe. Nobody has to vote yes or no. Well, Mr. President, I've been here long enough to know that the people in my state expect me to vote yes or no, not maybe. I ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is considering the motion to proceed to H.R. 3204.
And, Mr. President, has there been, is time divided in any fashion?
It is not.
Okay, Mr. President, I simply suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And the Senate back in a quorum call. We're waiting for a member to come to the floor to speak. The Senate this week looking at the ENDA legislation, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, protecting workers in certain gender and sexual groups from discrimination. Debate and votes on amendments expected today. Final passage later this week. Our live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2. Meanwhile, on C-SPAN, coming up in about 15 minutes, live coverage at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a Senate Homeland Security Subcommittee examines Hurricane Sandy recovery efforts. Later on today, 8 o'clock Eastern Time on C-SPAN, we'll re-air the Senate Finance Committee hearing from earlier today when members heard from Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius on the rollout of the nation's health care law and problems with the healthcare.gov website. Here on C-SPAN 2, it's live coverage of the Senate as we wait for a senator to come to the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor once again today to talk about jobs, about manufacturing.